In the unforgiving expanse of the American frontier, fate weaves a tale of loss and redemption. Sarah Mitchell's world shatters when ruthless settlers murder her husband and leave her to die in the scorching desert. As vultures circle overhead and her strength ebbs away with each passing hour, a silhouette appears on the horizon, a ghost from her past she never expected to see again. Jackson Reed, the wealthy rancher whose courtship she once spurned, discovers her clinging to life in the merciless sand. Despite their history, he doesn't hesitate to scoop her broken form into his arms and carry her to safety at his sprawling ranch. Could the man she once deemed too refined for frontier life become the anchor she needs in her darkest hour? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The faded daguerreotype sat on Sarah Mitchell's dresser, its silver surface catching the morning light that streamed through the homestead's window. In it, Thomas stood proud beside her, his work-worn hands resting on the fence they'd built together just last spring. His eyes crinkled at the corners with joy, and Sarah's own smile reflected the contentment of that moment, before the troubles began, before the settlers came. Sarah traced her finger along the edge of the frame, remembering how different life had been just 6 months ago. The small farm they'd carved out of the Montana Territory had been everything they'd dreamed of when they'd left Missouri. 20 acres of promise, Thomas had called it, and every sunrise brought them closer to making that promise real. She remembered the morning Jackson Reed first rode up their dusty path, his black stallion gleaming with care that spoke of wealth and privilege. He'd cut an impressive figure against the backdrop of their modest homestead, his clothes finer than anything seen in these parts, yet there was something genuine in his eyes that had caught her attention. "Ma'am," he'd said, removing his hat with a grace that seemed out of place in the rugged territory. "I'm Jackson Reed, your neighbor." To the north, his ranch, she would later learn, sprawled across 5,000 acres of the territory's finest grazing land. Thomas had been in the field that day, and Sarah had found herself alone with the handsome rancher. His courtship, subtle at first, grew more earnest with each passing visit. He brought books, precious commodities in the territory, and spoke of places she'd only dreamed of seeing. Paris, London, New York City, places that seemed as distant as the stars themselves from their humble homestead. But it was precisely that distance, that gulf between their worlds, that had ultimately led her to turn him away. "I'm a farmer's wife, Mr. Reed," she told him one autumn evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. "I don't belong in your world of grand parties and social seasons." He'd argued, of course, with all the passion of a man unused to hearing the word no. "The world is changing, Sarah. The territory is changing. There's room for both refinement and rugged strength here." But she'd made her choice long before. He spoke those words. Thomas was her rock, her partner in building something real and tangible from the earth itself. The memory of Jackson's last visit flickered through her mind as she set the daguerreotype back on the dresser. He'd been different that day, more subdued, his usual confidence tempered by something that looked almost like resignation. "I respect your choice, Mrs. Mitchell," he'd said, using her formal name for the first time since they'd met. "But should you ever need anything at all, my door is always open." Those words would come back to haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. For now, though, she turned to the tasks at hand. The morning sun was climbing higher, and there was bread to bake, chickens to feed, and always more work than hours. In the day, through the window, she could see Thomas in the distance, his figure small against the vast Montana sky as he worked the field. They'd been hearing rumors of trouble, settlers pushing into territory that wasn't rightfully theirs, disputes turning violent in the next county over. But such concerns seemed distant from their quiet corner of the world, where the rhythm of their days was marked by honest work and simple pleasures. If she'd known then how quickly their peace would shatter, how soon their quiet corner would become the eye of a storm. Perhaps she would have done things differently. Perhaps she would have paid more attention to the strangers who'd begun appearing at the edges of their property. Watching, waiting. Perhaps she would have convinced Thomas to accept Jackson Reed's offer to buy their land at a generous price. But that was the thing about life-changing moments. You never recognized them until they were already part of your past, like the fading image in the daguerreotype, forever frozen in a time that could never be reclaimed. The pocket watch lay in the dust, its glass face spiderwebbed with cracks, hands frozen at 9:47. Thomas had wound it that morning, as he did every morning, the familiar ritual as much a part of their lives as the crow of roosters or the smell of coffee brewing on the wood stove. Sarah would always remember how the morning light caught the brass case as he checked the time, one final time before heading out to the north field. "Might rain later," he'd said, squinting at the gathering clouds. "Best get an early start." He'd kissed her goodbye, his lips warm against her forehead, whiskers scratching her skin in that familiar way that had become so dear over their years together. The ordinary moment held no hint of the violence to come. They appeared like spectres. Through the morning mist, 6 riders, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth. Sarah spotted them from the kitchen window where she was kneading bread dough, her hands covered in flour. She recognized their leader immediately, Marcus Thorne, the man who'd been pressuring local farmers to sell their land at prices that amounted to theft. Thomas was too far away when they approached the house. She wanted to call out to him, to warn him, but something in Thorne's eyes as he dismounted made her blood run cold. These weren't men who'd come to talk. Mrs. Mitchell, Thorne's voice, carried a false warmth that made her skin crawl. "Beautiful morning for a ride, isn't it?" He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy, but his eyes remained hard as flint. "Your husband about?" Before she could answer, Thomas's voice rang out across the yard. He must have seen them from the field. "Sarah, get inside." The urgency in his tone sent her heart racing, but Thorne's men had already positioned themselves around the house. What happened next played out like a nightmare in slow motion. Thomas running toward the house, Thorne's casual signal to his men, the first shot cracking through the morning air like thunder. Sarah screamed as Thomas stumbled, but kept coming, determination etched on his face, even as the second shot found its mark. She tried to run to him, but rough hands grabbed her arms, holding her back as Thomas fell. His pocket watch slipped from his vest, hitting the ground with a sound that seemed to echo across the universe. Their eyes met one last time across the yard, and she saw in his gaze all the love and regret and fury that words could never express. "Should have taken Reed's offer when you had the chance," Thorne said, his voice distant through the roaring in her ears. "Land's too valuable to waste. On stubborn farmers." He nodded to his men. "Take her for a ride. Make sure she's far enough out that nobody finds her too quick." They bound her hands and forced her onto a horse, deaf to her screams and struggles. As they rode away, she caught one last glimpse of Thomas lying motionless in their yard, his blood soaking into the earth they'd worked together, his broken watch marking the moment their world ended. The sun climbed higher as they rode, the morning's clouds burning away to reveal a merciless blue sky. She lost track of time and direction as they pushed deeper into the territory's most desolate reaches. When they finally stopped, it was in a place where the desert stretched endlessly in every direction, no landmarks visible to guide a wanderer home. "Time to get down, Mrs. Mitchell," one of Thorne's men said, his grin revealing tobacco-stained teeth. They cut the ropes binding her to the saddle and shoved her roughly to the ground. She fell hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. "Give my regards to the vultures," another called as they wheeled their horses around. Their laughter carried back to her on the hot wind as they rode away, leaving her alone with the desert sun climbing toward its zenith. Sarah lay there for a long moment, pain and grief threatening to overwhelm her, but something in her refused to surrender, refused to give Thorne the satisfaction of such an easy victory. She pushed herself to her knees, then to her feet, her body protesting every movement. The sun beat down mercilessly as she stood swaying in the vastness of the desert. No water, no shelter, no hope visible in any direction. But she was Thomas Mitchell's wife, and she would not die weeping in the dust. She would walk until she couldn't walk anymore, and then she would crawl if she had to. As she took her first stumbling step, the image of Thomas's broken watch flashed through her mind. Time frozen at the moment, everything changed. She didn't know then that her next encounter with time would come through the man she'd once turned away, or that fate had plans far different from the death Thorn had intended for her in this desolate place. The wool shawl that had been a wedding gift from Thomas's mother became Sarah's only shield against the merciless sun. As the day wore on, she tore strips from its edges, wrapping her face and neck, leaving only her eyes exposed to the scorching wind. Each thread that unraveled seemed to carry with it a memory of cooler days, of gentle hands, of a life that now felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. The sun tracked across the sky like a burning eye, watching her stumbling progress. Through the wasteland, she had no way to mark time except by its position and the lengthening of shadows. Her throat had long since passed dry, moving into a territory of pain she hadn't known existed. Each swallow felt like forcing down broken glass. Mirages danced on the horizon, water, trees, buildings that shimmered and vanished as she approached. More than once, she thought she heard Thomas calling her name. But when she turned, there was only the whisper of wind through the scrub brush and the mocking cry of circling vultures. "One more step," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking. It had become her mantra as the hours crawled by. Just one more step. She fixed her eyes on distant landmarks, a twisted Joshua tree, a distinctive rock formation, only to reach them and find the landscape ahead just as empty, just as unforgiving. The shawl, now reduced to little more than strips of fabric, had been white once. Now it was stained with dust and sweat, much like her memories of that morning were stained with blood. She tried not to think about Thomas, about the way he'd fallen, about his eyes meeting hers one final time. Such thoughts would only steal what little strength she had left. Instead, she forced herself to focus on practical matters. The angle of the sun suggested it was late afternoon. If she could survive until nightfall, the dropping temperature might give her a better chance. But night would bring its own dangers. Cold, that could kill as surely as the heat, predators that hunted in the darkness. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell hard onto the packed earth. The impact sent clouds of dust billowing around her, and for a moment she was tempted to just lie there, to let the desert claim her as Thorn had intended. But Thomas's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, as clear as if he stood beside her. "Get up, my love. Get up and live." Using trembling arms, she pushed herself back to her feet. The world swayed dangerously around her, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She adjusted the strips of shawl around her face, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion. It was then that she saw it, a dark shape on the horizon, moving steadily closer. At first, she dismissed it as another mirage, her mind playing cruel tricks. But this shape didn't waver and dissolve like the others. It grew more solid with each passing moment, a rider on horseback moving with purpose. Fear shot through her like ice water. Had Thorn sent one of his men back to make sure she was dead? She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the landscape offered no shelter. Even the scattered brush was too sparse to conceal her. The rider drew closer, and something about the way he sat his horse tugged at her memory. The proud bearing, the straight back, the distinctive silhouette. In her delirium, she almost laughed at the irony. Of all the people who might find her here, fate had chosen Jackson Reed. She tried to call out, but her parched throat produced only a weak rasp. The strips of shawl fluttered around her face as she waved her arms, praying he would see her. Her vision blurred, the world tilting sideways as her strength finally failed her. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was Jackson's figure growing larger against the burning sky. like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to make. The silver canteen caught the last rays of the setting sun as Jackson uncorked it with practiced care. Despite her semi-conscious state, Sarah could hear the precious water sloshing inside, a sound more beautiful than any symphony she'd ever heard. His hand, surprisingly gentle for a rancher, cradled her head as he brought the canteen to her. Cracked lips. "Easy now." His voice came from somewhere above her, steady and calm. "Small sips, Sarah. Too much at once will make you sick." The water touched her lips, cool and sweet, and it took every ounce of willpower not to grab the canteen and drain it dry. Jackson's face swam into focus as she blinked away the dust and fatigue. He looked different from her memories, older perhaps, or just more weathered by the responsibilities of managing his vast ranch. The fine clothes she remembered had been replaced by practical riding gear, though even these bore the unmistakable mark of quality. "I found Thomas," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her heart constrict. "I've sent 2 of my men to the sheriff in Preston's Fork. They'll see justice done." The simple statement held a promise of retribution that seemed at odds with the refined man she'd once known. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. Jackson offered her another sip from the canteen, his eyes never leaving. Her face. "Don't try to talk yet. We need to get you out of this sun." He glanced at the horizon, where the desert heat still shimmered like a living thing. "My ranch is closest. Can you hold on if I put you up in front of me?" Sarah managed. A weak nod, though the thought of movement sent waves of dizziness through her. Jackson's arms were steady as he lifted her, positioning her carefully on his horse. The animal stood perfectly still, well-trained and patient, as Jackson mounted behind her. "Lean back against me," he instructed, his voice professional, devoid of any hint of their shared past. "I'll keep you steady." He wrapped one arm securely around her waist while the other held the reins, creating a cage of safety she hadn't expected to feel ever again. The rhythm of the horse's gait threatened to lull her back into unconsciousness, but Jackson kept her engaged with quiet conversation. He spoke of practical things, the weather, the distance to his ranch, the doctor he'd send for once they arrived. His voice anchored her to the present, keeping her from slipping into memories of that morning's horror. "The ranch has changed since you saw it last," he said as they crested a rise. "Added a new wing to the main house, better facilities for the hands and their families." He paused, then added softly, "I've learned some things about what really matters out here." Sarah wanted to respond, to acknowledge the subtle reference to their past interactions, but exhaustion dragged at her like quicksand. She found herself drifting in and out of awareness, catching fragments of scenery and conversation. The canteen appeared regularly at her lips, Jackson's careful rationing of water the only thing keeping her from complete collapse. The sun had nearly set when the ranch buildings appeared on the horizon. Even through her fatigue, Sarah could see the truth in Jackson's words. The sprawling complex spoke of both prosperity and practicality. A working ranch, not just a rich man's plaything. "Miss Rebecca," Jackson's voice carried across the yard as they approached. "Prepare the blue room and send someone for Doc Matthews." A flurry of activity erupted around them as ranch hands and house staff appeared from various directions. "The blue room's ready, Mr. Reed," a woman's voice replied promptly. "Martha's already heading for the doctor." Jackson dismounted smoothly, then lifted Sarah from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. She caught a glimpse of concerned faces watching from the porch, a middle-aged woman who must be Miss Rebecca, several ranch hands trying not to stare, a young boy running ahead to open doors. "You're safe now," Jackson murmured as he carried her into the house. The words seemed to unlock something inside her, and Sarah felt tears beginning to slide down her dust-streaked face. She turned her head into his shirt, not wanting the others to see her break. His arms tightened slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been unconscious. The silver canteen bumped gently against her side as he climbed the stairs. Its hollow sound a reminder of how close she'd come to dying in the desert. But here she was, alive against all odds, being carried to safety by the man she'd once deemed too refined for the harsh realities of frontier life. The irony of it might have made her laugh if she'd had the strength. Instead, she let herself be borne up the stairs, knowing that while she was safe from the desert's threats, the real challenges, grief, revenge, and the complicated history between her and her rescuer were only beginning. The medicine box sat on the bedside table in the blue room, its dark mahogany surface gleaming in the lamplight. Sarah watched as Miss Rebecca sorted through its contents. Bottles of various sizes, clean bandages, herbs both familiar and strange. The housekeeper's movements were precise and practiced, speaking of years of experience tending to the injuries and ailments that were an inevitable part of ranch life. Mr. Reed had this brought from San Francisco, Miss Rebecca explained, measuring out drops from a brown bottle. Said a proper ranch needs proper medical supplies. She paused, weathered hands stilling for a moment. Though I suspect he ordered it after young Billy took that fall last spring. The boy might have lost his leg if we hadn't had what we needed right here. Sarah sipped the bitter medicine, noting how different it was from the simple remedies she'd used on her own farm. Everything about Jackson's ranch spoke of careful planning and resources she'd never imagined when she dismissed him as merely wealthy. He's changed, Miss Rebecca said quietly, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. Still got his fine manners and education, mind you, but he's learned the true meaning of responsibility. She began rebandaging Sarah's sunburned hands with gentle efficiency. Lost his father 2 years back. Could have sold the ranch, moved back east to an easier life. Instead, he dug in deeper, made this place something his father never dreamed it could be. The days blended together in a haze of sleep and healing. Doc Matthews came and went, his visits punctuated by quiet consultations with Jackson in the hallway. Sarah caught fragments of their conversations, concerns about dehydration, the need for rest, warnings about the emotional trauma she'd endured. Jackson himself maintained a careful distance, appearing only when necessary, and always with others present. Yet his influence was everywhere, in the quality of care she received, in the quiet efficiency of the household, in the way even the youngest ranch hands spoke of him with respect rather than fear. Through the window, Sarah could see the daily life of the ranch unfolding. Cowboys rode out at dawn and returned at dusk. Wagons arrived loaded with supplies. Children of the ranch hands played in the yard under the watchful eyes of their mothers. It was a world as different from her small farm as she'd once feared, yet somehow not in the ways she'd imagined. He's been riding out himself every day. Miss Rebecca mentioned casually one afternoon as she changed the sheets, looking for signs of Thorne and his men. She smoothed a wrinkle from the fresh linens with more force than necessary. Sheriff's got a posse out too, but Mr. Reed, well, he takes this personal-like. The medicine box yielded new remedies as her recovery progressed. Salves for her sunburned skin, powders to help her sleep when nightmares of Thomas's death jolted her awake. Each item seemed to represent a different facet of healing, both physical and spiritual. One evening, as sunset painted the room in shades of gold, Jackson himself appeared with a new addition to the medicine box. "Chamomile tea," he said, holding up a small tin. "My mother swore by it for troubled thoughts." He set it beside the other supplies and turned to leave, but Sarah found her voice at last. Jackson. His name felt strange on her tongue after so many years. He paused at the door but didn't turn. "Thank you for everything." "You should rest," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Doc Matthews says you can try sitting up in the garden tomorrow if you feel strong enough." He hesitated, then added, "The roses are blooming. They might help remind you that life goes on, even after the harshest drought." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Before Sarah could respond, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway. She stared at the medicine box, understanding now that it contained more than just physical remedies. Like everything else about Jackson Reed's ranch, it represented a deeper kind of healing, one that would require far more courage than simply surviving the desert. Miss Rebecca appeared with the evening meal, her experienced eyes taking in Sarah's thoughtful expression. "Time and proper care heal most wounds," she said wisely, arranging the tray. "And some hurts need more than what's in that box to mend properly." She patted Sarah's hand gently. "Good thing there's plenty of both time and care here at the Reed Ranch." The letter emerged from between the pages of a book Miss Rebecca had brought to help pass the time, a volume of Tennyson's poetry that had clearly sat untouched on Jackson's library shelves for years. The envelope was yellowed with age, the elegant handwriting instantly recognizable as Jackson's, though the ink had faded to a gentle sepia. It was still sealed, Sarah's maiden name written across the front with a careful flourish. Her hands trembled as she held it. The date in the corner marked it as having been written the day after she'd rejected his courtship. She'd never known of its existence. Had he meant to deliver it but lost his nerve? Or had he written it in a moment of passion, only to think better of sending it? "I remember him writing that." Miss Rebecca's voice came softly from the doorway. "Sat at his desk all night, he did. Started over maybe dozen times." The housekeeper moved into the room, gathering up the breakfast dishes. "Found all the discarded versions in the wastebasket next morning. Never did know why he didn't send it." Sarah stared at the unopened letter, feeling the weight of years and unspoken words. "Should I?" she began, unsure if reading it now would help or harm the delicate balance they'd established. "Some truths need their proper time," Miss Rebecca replied. "Maybe that time is now." She paused at the door. "He's changed since then, mind you. We all have. But the heart of him, that's still the same." Left alone, Sarah broke the seal with trembling fingers. The paper crackled as she unfolded it, releasing a faint scent of Jackson's study, leather and pipe tobacco, preserved all these years. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, the formal handwriting betraying a slight tremor. "By the time you read this, I will have already left for San Francisco. I tell myself it's for business, but we both know I'm running from the pain of your rejection, pain I have no right to feel, given how badly I mishandled everything." Sarah's breath caught as she continued reading. "I came to you speaking of Paris and London, of grand houses and society parties, thinking these were treasures any woman would desire. How blind I was not to see that your treasure was the very life I so carelessly dismissed. The honest work, the land you nurture, the home you've built with your own hands." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. "I spoke of changing the territory, of bringing civilization to the frontier. But you saw what I couldn't then, that there is as much civilization in a well-tended garden as in any opera house, as much nobility in farming as in any social season. You were right to turn me away. I was not yet the man I needed to be. I thought I could simply purchase happiness, yours and mine, as I would a fine horse or a new suit. I know now that real happiness, like real love, must be earned through understanding, respect, and shared purpose." The letter continued, the careful script becoming slightly more hurried, as if the words were finally breaking free of some long-held restraint. "I make you this promise, though you may never read it. I will learn. I will understand what it truly means to work this land, to be worthy of it, and the people who give their lives to it. Perhaps someday, if fate is kind, our paths will cross again, and you will find me changed, not into the society gentleman I once thought I should be, but into the man this territory needs." The final paragraph made her heart ache with its simple sincerity. "Until then, I wish you and Thomas every happiness. Your love for each other and for your land has taught me more than all my years of education. Thank you for that harsh but necessary lesson. With deepest respect and enduring affection, Jackson." Sarah folded the letter carefully, her thoughts in turmoil. The man who had written these words was still visible in the Jackson she knew now, in his quiet competence, his care for his people, his deep connection to the land. But there was a new hardness too, a protective shell grown over old wounds. Outside her window, she could see him in the corral, working with a young horse. His movements were patient, confident, showing none of the aristocratic awkwardness she remembered. He had indeed learned, had transformed himself just as he'd promised in the letter. But that transformation had come at a cost she was only beginning to understand. The letter felt heavy in her hands, weighted with years of unspoken feelings and might-have-beens. She tucked it carefully back into its envelope, knowing that while it explained the past, it couldn't answer the question that now pressed most heavily on her heart. Could two people, changed by time and tragedy, find their way back to a beginning they'd missed years ago? The leather-bound ledger lay open on Jackson's desk, its pages filled with more than just numbers. Between the careful columns of figures were notes about the ranch hands' families, reminders of children's birthdays, annotations about medical expenses paid, and loans advanced. Sarah's fingers traced the neat handwriting, so different from the emotional script of his long-ago letter, yet revealing just as much about the man he'd become. "Mr. Reed likes to keep track of everything himself," young Billy explained as he helped her sort through the ranch's supply records. Her strength had returned enough to take short walks, and she'd found herself drawn to the ranch's office, seeking to understand this place that was so different from what she'd imagined years ago. "See here?" Billy pointed to a margin note. "That's where he wrote about my ma's medicine when she took sick last winter. Paid for the doctor himself, he did, and never asked for it back." The boy's pride in his employer was evident in every word. "Said a ranch is only as strong as its people." Through the office window, Sarah watched Jackson moving through the morning's activities. He stopped to help a hand repair a wagon wheel, his expensive shirt sleeves rolled up, hands as dirty as any worker's. When the pregnant wife of one of the Cowboys appeared with a concern about their cabin's roof, he immediately called for the carpenter and made arrangements for temporary lodging in the main house. "He's got a system for everything," Billy continued, showing her the carefully organized ledgers. "Breeding records, grazing rotations, water rights." He pulled out a map marked with detailed annotations. "Even plans for which pastures to rest each season. My pa says Mr. Reed thinks more like a farmer than most ranchers." The comment struck Sarah deeply. She remembered how she'd once dismissed Jackson as someone who'd never understand the intimate relationship with the land that farming required. Yet here was evidence that he'd not only learned to understand it, but had applied that knowledge on a scale she'd never imagined. A commotion in the yard drew their attention. One of the hands had been thrown from a horse, and Jackson was already there, helping the man up, checking for injuries. Sarah watched as he handled the situation with calm efficiency, sending for the doctor while ensuring the injured man's duties would be covered without loss of pay. "Reminds me of how he handled my accident," Billy said, unconsciously rubbing his previously injured leg. "Wasn't just about the medicine and doctor's bills. He made sure my family had extra help while I was healing, kept my position waiting for me." The boy's voice held a mixture of respect and affection. "Ma says there's not another ranch boss in the territory who'd do the same." The afternoon brought more revelations as Sarah observed the ranch's operations. Jackson's refinement, which she'd once seen as a barrier, now served as a bridge between worlds. He negotiated contracts with Eastern buyers, using his education and connections to secure better prices than local ranchers typically received. But he also ensured those profits were reinvested in the ranch and its people, building a community rather than just a business. "We're expanding the school next month," he mentioned quietly, finding her still in the office as evening approached. "Too many children now for just one room." He hesitated, then added, "Education's important out here. Not just reading and figures, but understanding the land, the business of it, things I had to learn the hard way." Sarah nodded, thinking of the ledger's careful notations. "You've built something remarkable here, Jackson. It's so much more than just a ranch." "Had to be," he replied, his voice carrying a weight of memory. After I understood what I'd been missing, I knew this place needed to be about more than just profit or prestige. He moved to his desk, automatically, straightening the ledgers. Every family here has a stake in its success. Their children will inherit more than just jobs. They'll inherit a legacy of stewardship. The setting sun cast long shadows through the office window, gilding the ledger's pages with warm light. Sarah saw her own shadow merge with Jackson's on the desk between them, and for a moment she glimpsed a future she'd never allowed herself to imagine years ago, one where refinement and practicality, ambition and compassion could not just coexist, but strengthen each other. The note arrived with the morning mail, its crude paper and rough handwriting a stark contrast to the business correspondence that usually crossed Jackson's desk. Sarah recognized it immediately as the kind of cheap stock sold at Thorne's general store, and her hands trembled as Jackson unfolded it. "Mr. Reed," he read aloud, his voice carefully controlled, "your interference in private business matters has been noted. The Mitchell woman's presence on your property is an affront to those of us working to civilize this territory. Consider this fair warning. Remove her from the area within 3 days, or we'll be forced to take more direct action. The prosperity of your ranch depends on your wise decision in this matter." The paper crackled as Jackson's fingers tightened around it. "Thorne's getting desperate," he said, his refined accent carrying an edge of steel she'd never heard before. "The sheriff's investigation must be making him nervous." Sarah stood by the window watching the ranch hands go about their morning duties, unaware of the threat that had just arrived. "I should leave," she said quietly. "I won't bring danger to your people, Jackson. Not after everything you've done for me." "No." The single word carried the weight of absolute authority. Jackson moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could sense the tension radiating from him. "This is exactly what Thorne wants, to isolate you, to make you vulnerable again. I won't give him that satisfaction." A commotion in the yard drew their attention. 2 ranch hands were riding in hard, their horses lathered with sweat. Jackson was moving before they even dismounted, Sarah following close behind. "Mr. Reed!" The younger hand, barely more than a boy, called out. "Found fresh tracks up by the north pasture. 6 riders moving along our boundary. They've been watching the ranch, sir." The older hand spat into the dust. "Saw smoke signals. 2. Indian style, but no Indians in these parts for months. Someone's trying to coordinate something, and I'd bet my last dollar it's Thorne's men." Jackson's face hardened. "Get word to all the outlying stations. I want everyone on alert. No one rides alone, no matter how short the distance." He turned to Miss Rebecca, who had appeared on the porch. "Make sure all the families know to stay close to the main buildings after dark." The efficiency with which the ranch responded to the threat spoke of preparation Sarah hadn't noticed before. Armed men appeared at strategic points around the property. Children were quickly gathered from their play and moved indoors. Even the cattle were being herded closer to the protected central pastures. "You've been expecting this," she realized, watching Jackson issue orders with calm precision. "Since the day I found you in the desert." He led her back inside, pausing to check the loading of a rifle by the door. "Thorne's type doesn't stop at one act of violence. He's been trying to drive small ranchers and farmers out of the territory for years, using fear and force where money won't work." In his study, Jackson pulled out a map marked with recent incidents: burned barns, poisoned wells, mysterious cattle deaths. He's been building his power base slowly, staying just within the law or paying off those who might enforce it. Until now. "Thomas's murder changed things," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "It was too public, too violent to ignore." Jackson nodded grimly. "The sheriff's been gathering evidence, building a case that even Thorne's money can't bury. This note," he tapped the crude paper, "this is the reaction of a man who sees his empire starting to crumble." A soft knock interrupted them. Miss Rebecca entered, her usual calm demeanor slightly shaken. "Riders spotted on the East Road, Mr. Reed. And Martha found this nailed to the schoolhouse door." She handed over another note, this one written in blood-red ink. "Next time it won't be ink," Jackson read, his voice hard. He crumpled the paper in his fist, but Sarah had seen enough to recognize the same crude stock as the first note. "He's trying to frighten us into making a mistake," Jackson said, moving to his desk and pulling out his own writing materials. "Time to show him he's not the only one who can send messages." He began writing swiftly, his pen scratching against fine paper. Sarah watched him work, seeing in his focused expression the same determination she'd once mistaken for mere aristocratic pride. "What are you going to do? Remind him that civilization cuts both ways." Jackson sealed the letter with his signet ring. "He thinks he's fighting simple farmers and ranchers. Time he learned that some of us know how to wage war in the courts and boardrooms as well as on the open range." The threatening notes lay on his desk, like physical manifestations of the danger surrounding them. But as Sarah watched Jackson dispatch riders with his carefully worded responses, she realized that the refined gentleman she'd once rejected had become something far more formidable, a man who could fight with both law books and bullets, and who wasn't afraid to use either to protect what he valued. The territory map spread across Jackson's study table told a story in its carefully marked annotations. Red circles indicated known locations of Thorne's men, blue lines traced water rights and property boundaries, and small crosses marked spots where violence had already visited other homesteads. Sarah's own farm was marked with a black X that made her heart ache every time she saw it. "The sheriff's deputized extra men," Jackson explained, adding new markings to the map as reports came in. "But Thorne's influence reaches deeper than we initially thought. 2 of the deputies were seen at his store yesterday, walking out with heavy purses." Sarah traced the boundaries of Jackson's ranch with her finger, noting how it formed a natural barrier between Thorne's operations and the smaller farms to the south. "You've been protecting them all along, haven't you? Not just me." Jackson's hand paused in its marking. "After I read about the first farm burning, I began buying up strategic properties, created a buffer zone." He indicated several small parcels marked in green, offered fair prices, helped families relocate if they wanted to sell, better than leaving them vulnerable to Thorne's tactics. "Like you offered to buy our farm," Sarah said softly, understanding now what she hadn't then. "You weren't trying to expand your ranch. You were trying to protect us. You and Thomas had worked too hard for your land. I knew you wouldn't sell." A shadow crossed his face. "Should have tried harder to convince you of the danger." Sarah placed her hand over his where it rested on the map. "You can't blame yourself for Thorne's actions, Jackson." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Then the door opened, and Miss Rebecca entered with a fresh pot of coffee and news from the outer stations. Riders spotted. "Near Thompson's Creek," she reported, setting down the tray. "But our men were ready. Turned them back before they got within rifle range of the herd." She pointed to a section of the map. "Miguel says they're setting up camp here, just beyond our boundary." Jackson added another red circle to the map. "They're trying to surround us slowly, testing our defenses." He studied the pattern of markers, "but they don't know about our arrangements with the other ranches." Sarah looked closer at the map, noting thin pencil lines connecting various properties. "Alliances. Better." Jackson allowed himself a small smile. "Legal contracts, mutual defense agreements, water-sharing pacts, grazing rights, all filed with the territorial court and backed by some of the most powerful ranchers in the region." He tapped several locations. "Thorne thinks he's dealing with isolated holdings he can pick off one by one. He doesn't realize he's facing a united front." Miss Rebecca nodded approvingly. "The wives have been organizing too. Set up a system of signals. Laundry hung in certain ways means different warnings. Martha's teaching the children to watch for them." The complexity of the preparations impressed Sarah. Every aspect of ranch life had been adapted to face the threat, yet daily work continued almost normally. Children still attended lessons in the schoolhouse. Cattle were still moved between pastures. Meals were still served at regular hours. "We've got something Thorne doesn't understand," Jackson said, studying the map. Community. He builds power through fear and money. We build it through trust and mutual support. He began marking new positions for the night watch. Every family here knows they're part of something larger than themselves. Sarah thought of her own small farm, how isolated she and Thomas had been. I never realized. When I turned you away, I thought I was choosing a simpler life. But simple doesn't always mean stronger, does it? Jackson's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw in them the same warmth that had drawn her to him years ago, now tempered by experience and responsibility. Strength comes in many forms, he said quietly. You taught me that, even if you didn't mean to. A ranch hand appeared at the door with fresh reports, and they returned their attention to the map. But something had shifted between them, a new understanding born of shared purpose and dawning trust. As they planned defenses and discussed strategies, Sarah realized that the map before them represented more than just territory and tactics. It was a chart of relationships, connections, and the kind of strength that could only come from people working together. The sun was setting when they finally finished their planning, casting long shadows across the map's inked surface. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Sarah felt a sense of security she hadn't known since Thomas's death. Here, surrounded by people who understood the true meaning of community, she was no longer alone in her fight for justice. The splintered fence post stood like an accusation in the early morning light, its fresh break revealing pale wood beneath the weathered surface. Sarah ran her hand along the jagged edge where the attackers had broken through, feeling the violence of the previous night preserved in wood and wire. They came just before dawn, Miguel explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. Used the storm for cover, thunder hiding the sound of their approach. The experienced ranch hand pointed to marks in the mud. 6 riders, maybe 7, tried to stampede the north herd toward Thompson's Creek. Jackson knelt to examine the tracks, his manner reminding Sarah of a scholar studying an ancient text. They didn't expect us to have men stationed in the line shack, he said, attention fixed on the story written in the earth. See here, where they wheeled their horses? That's when our warning shots surprised them. The night's events played back in Sarah's mind. The crash of thunder that wasn't thunder, Jackson's swift movement from his study chair to the gun rack, the organized response that spoke of long preparation. She'd watched from an upstairs window as lanterns blazed to life across the ranch. Movements she now knew were signals passing between hidden watchers. They fired the old hay barn, young Billy added, eager to share his part in the night's events. But we were ready with the water wagon, just like Mr. Reed planned. Pride colored the boy's voice. Didn't lose more than a few bales. Jackson straightened, brushing mud from his knees. They're testing us, learning our responses. His refined accent carried the same steel she'd heard in his letter to Thorne. But they learned the wrong lessons. They think they've discovered our defensive positions. They don't realize what they saw was exactly what we wanted them to see. Sarah studied the broken fence post, understanding dawning. You've been preparing for this for months, haven't you? Everything they saw last night was planned. Every ranch hand who fired a warning shot, every lantern that lit up, every position they spotted, all carefully chosen. Jackson's smile held no warmth. Let them think they know our weaknesses. Next time they'll aim for what they believe is a gap in our defenses, and that's when we'll have them. The morning revealed more signs of the attack. Trampled grass where the riders had gathered, scattered cartridge casings that spoke of wild shooting, a forgotten hat that Miguel identified as belonging to one of Thorne's men. But the ranch itself stood solid, its defenses proven, its people more united than ever. Could have been worse, Miss Rebecca observed, bringing coffee to the men examining the fence. Much worse if Mr. Reed hadn't been planning for this since winter. She gave Sarah a meaningful look. Been ordering extra supplies, stockpiling, ammunition, training the hands in more than just ranch work. The broken fence post became a gathering point as more ranch hands arrived to begin repairs. Sarah watched them work together seamlessly, no orders needed, each person knowing their role. Here was the true strength of Jackson's ranch, not in its size or wealth, but in its people's quiet competence and shared purpose. "They'll come again," Jackson said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "Probably tonight or tomorrow. Thorne's not known for patience, and this failure will have angered him." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "This is because of me. They wouldn't be attacking if—" "No." Jackson's hand touched her arm briefly, the contact sending warmth through her despite the morning chill. "This was coming anyway. Thorne's been working up to something like this for months. You're just the excuse he needed, not the cause." A rider appeared on the ridge above them, and every hand reached for a weapon before recognizing the distinctive shape of Hank, one of their outriders. He spurred his horse down the slope, his expression urgent. "Mr. Reed, smoke signals from the Peterson place. They've spotted 2 groups of riders moving through the high country. Looks like they're trying to split our attention." Jackson's response was immediate. "Miguel, take 4 men and reinforce Peterson's northern boundary. Billy, ride for the sheriff. Tell him what happened here last night. The rest of you, double-check all our defensive positions. They'll try to press their advantage while they think we're distracted with repairs." The broken fence post stood. Witness as the ranch hands dispersed to their tasks, its splintered form a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. Sarah watched Jackson organizing the ranch's response, seeing in him now what she'd failed to see years ago, a man who could balance refinement with raw frontier strength, who could fight with both strategy and force when needed. The morning. Sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. But as Sarah helped Miss Rebecca organize medical supplies and ammunition, she felt a fierce pride growing. Thorne might have broken their fence, but he'd only succeeded in revealing the true strength of the community he sought to destroy. The yellowed newspaper clipping fell from between the pages of an old territorial record book as Sarah helped Jackson research property deeds. The San Francisco Chronicle's masthead was still clearly visible, though the date had faded to near illegibility. March 1873, just over 2 years ago. "Railroad Commission announces new territory routes," the headline declared. But it was the grainy photograph beneath that caught Sarah's attention, a group of well-dressed men standing before the territorial governor's mansion. In the back row, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for him, stood Marcus Thorne. "I remember this," Jackson said quietly, taking the clipping from her trembling hands. "It was right after my father died. There was talk about railroad, expansion, new routes being planned through the territory." His finger traced the lines of text. But the proposed routes were kept secret to prevent land speculation. Sarah leaned closer, reading the small print beneath the photograph. "Special Advisory Committee on Territory Development," she read aloud. "Marcus Thorne's name is listed as a local representative, a position he purchased with blood money," came a new voice from the doorway. They turned to find Sheriff Matthews standing there, his weathered face grave. "Sorry to interrupt, Reed, but this couldn't wait." He crossed to the desk, laying down a stack of documents. "Found these in a raid on one of Thorne's warehouses. Land deeds, property transfers, all dated months before the railroad routes were announced." Jackson spread the documents across his desk, his expression hardening as he read. He knew exactly where the rail lines would run, and he's been forcing people off their land to secure the right-of-way. Sarah's mind raced back to her own farm. "The creek that runs through our property. Thomas always said it was the most logical. A path through the hills. The perfect route for a railway line," the sheriff confirmed. "Thorne's been working both ends, getting himself appointed to the commission while strong-arming farmers off their land. Those who wouldn't sell ended up like Thomas," Sarah finished, her voice tight with anger. Jackson was already pulling out his territory map, overlaying it with the newspaper's vague sketch of proposed rail routes. "Here," he said, marking. "Points with quick strokes. Every property he's targeted, every farmer he's threatened, they all lie along these paths. And it goes higher than Thorne," Sheriff Matthews added grimly. Found telegraph correspondence with members of the territorial legislature, bribes, threats, promises of shares in future rail profits. He's got protection from people who should be stopping him. The newspaper photographs seemed to mock them from the desk, respected men in fine suits, plotting destruction behind respectable smiles. Sarah remembered Thomas's confusion when Thorne had first approached them, offering far less than their land was worth. "He knew we'd refuse to sell," she said softly. "He was counting on it, wasn't he? Giving himself justification for what he planned to do." "This changes everything," Jackson said, his voice carrying that quiet authority she'd come to recognize. "Thorne's not just a land-hungry rancher. He's part of a larger conspiracy, and that means we can fight him in ways he won't expect," the sheriff finished. "Railroad Commission doesn't take kindly to having its secrets sold. And there are still honest men in the territorial government who'll move against corruption if given proper evidence." Jackson was already drafting letters, his pen moving swiftly across fine paper. "I have connections in San Francisco, investors who've been watching the territory's development with interest. They won't appreciate learning their potential profits are being undermined by corrupt local officials." Sarah studied the newspaper photograph again, seeing past Thorne to the men around him, men of influence and power who thought themselves untouchable. "They're not just fighting for land anymore," she realized. "They're fighting to keep their whole scheme from being exposed, which makes them more dangerous," Jackson agreed, sealing his letters with careful precision. "But it also makes them vulnerable. Men like Thorne know how to deal with frightened farmers and defiant ranchers. They're not prepared for their own methods to be turned against them." The old newspaper clipping lay between them like a key unlocking a hidden door. Through it, Sarah could see the true scope of what they faced, not just a greedy man's violence, but a web of corruption that stretched from their small territory to the halls of power in San Francisco. But as she watched Jackson and the sheriff planning their next moves, she felt hope rising. Thorne had thought himself clever, playing both sides of the law while building his empire of theft and murder. He hadn't counted on facing opponents who could fight with documents and political connections as effectively as with rifles and courage. The leather-bound journal lay open on Sarah's desk, its pages filling with more than just a record of days. Miss Rebecca had given it to her weeks ago, suggesting that writing might help heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch. Now, by lamplight, Sarah's pen moved across the pristine pages, capturing thoughts she'd barely dared acknowledge even to herself. "Strange," she wrote, "how life's currents carry us back to places we thought we'd left behind forever. When I rejected Jackson's courtship years ago, I thought I was choosing a simpler path. Now I see there was nothing simple about any of it. Not my life with Thomas, not Jackson's transformation, not the way fate has brought us together again in these circumstances." She paused, watching shadows dance across the page. "Thomas would understand, I think. He always said I was too quick to judge, too certain of what was right and proper. Life's not a straight furrow, he used to tell me. Sometimes the plow has to turn back to make the field complete." The journal's pages held her growing awareness of change, both in herself and in her understanding of Jackson. "Watched him with the hands today," one entry read. "The way he moves between worlds so effortlessly now, discussing breeding lines with the foreman, then turning to write letters to San Francisco investors. The refinement I once scorned as weakness has become a weapon in our fight against Thorne." Another page captured quieter moments. "He still reads poetry. Found him in the library late last night, Tennyson open on his knee. But now the verses share space with territory maps and legal documents. He's learned to be both the man he was raised to be and the man this land needs. While I was judging him for not fitting into my world, he was building one big enough for both of us." The journal became a confidant for thoughts she couldn't share aloud. "Miss Rebecca says a heart can love deeply more than once, each love different but no less true. Thomas was my morning sun, bright, direct, warming the earth for things to grow. Jackson is like evening light, touching everything with gold, revealing depths I never knew existed. Fresh entries detailed the subtle shifts in their relationship. His hand brushed mine over the map today. Such a small thing, but I felt it like summer lightning. There's a tension between us now, different from the old days. We're no longer the young woman certain of her path, or the refined gentleman trying to impose his world on hers. We've both been broken and rebuilt, stronger at the mended places. Some pages held darker thoughts. The guilt comes at night when the house is quiet. Am I betraying Thomas by feeling this way? But then I remember his last words, his eyes meeting mine across that blood-stained yard. He wanted me to live, not just survive. Living means letting the heart beat fully, even when it beats in unexpected directions. Tonight's entry flowed from her pen with new certainty. I understand now what I couldn't then. True strength isn't in rejecting what seems foreign to our nature. It's in finding ways to grow beyond what we thought we could be. Jackson learned this years ago, while I'm only now catching up. He didn't abandon his refinement to become a rancher. He learned to be both and more. The lamp's oil burned low as she wrote one final passage. Tomorrow we move against Thorn, taking the fight. From the land to the courtrooms and newspaper offices. Jackson says it's like a chess game now, each move planned to trap our opponent. Chess, another thing I once thought too refined for frontier life. But that's the lesson, isn't it? We limit ourselves when we draw lines between what belongs here and what doesn't. The territory is big enough for poetry and cattle, for legal documents and 6 guns, for second chances and new beginnings. She closed the journal gently, running her fingers over its smooth cover. Outside her window, the night wind carried the sounds of the ranch, horses nickering in their stalls, the creak of windmills, bootsteps of men on watch. A world of refined strength and purposeful grace, built by a man she'd once thought too genteel for such work. A world that somehow had become home. The silver locket caught the first light of dawn as Jackson pressed it into Sarah's palm, its surface still warm from being carried close to his heart. "It was my mother's," he said, quietly, his voice nearly lost in the pre-battle tension filling his study. She wore it through every hardship, said it reminded her that beauty and strength could exist in the same moment. Sarah's fingers traced the delicate engraving, roses and thorns intertwined in an endless circle. Inside, she found a tiny scrap of paper with freshly written words, for all the moments both gentle and fierce. Her eyes met Jackson's, understanding passing between them without need for further speech. The moment was broken by Miguel's urgent arrival. "Riders coming, Mr. Reed, at least 20 men, approaching from 3 directions. Thorn's leading them himself." Jackson's transformation from gentle to commanding was immediate. "Get everyone to their positions. Signal the Peterson Ranch. We'll need their support from the north." He turned to Sarah, his eyes intense. "Are you ready?" She clasped the locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her collarbone. "They won't expect me to be here. Thorn thinks he frightened me away with his threats. That's we're counting on," Jackson agreed, checking his pistol with practiced ease. "Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't believe you dare to use." The confrontation unfolded like a deadly chess game. Thorn's men approached with the confidence of superior numbers, only to find themselves channeled into prepared positions by strategically placed ranch hands. Sarah watched from the upper window as Jackson stepped onto the porch, every inch the refined gentleman in his clean shirt and vest, a startling contrast to Thorn's trail-worn appearance. "That's close enough, Thorn," Jackson's cultured voice carried across the yard. "I believe you'll find we've made some interesting discoveries about your railroad dealings." Thorn's laugh was ugly. "Threats from a man who reads poetry. You're out of your depth, Reed. This is frontier justice we're dealing in." "Is that what you call murdering Thomas Mitchell? Justice?" Sarah's voice rang out as she emerged onto the porch beside Jackson. The silver locket gleamed at her throat, a symbol of defiance. The sight of her rocked Thorn visibly. "You're supposed to be gone," His control cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "The governor's office guaranteed me this territory. No farmer's widow is going to ruin everything." "That's exactly what we wanted to hear," came Sheriff Matthews' voice as he and his deputies emerged from their hidden positions around the yard. A confession of murder and conspiracy, witnessed by law officers and property owners. The next moments exploded into chaos. Thorne went for his gun, but Jackson was faster, his gentleman's reflexes honed by years of ranch life. Sarah's warning cry stopped one of Thorne's men from flanking Jackson, while Miguel and the ranch hands engaged the others in a swift, brutal exchange of gunfire. "The railroad commissions received copies of all your correspondence," Jackson called out as he kept Thorne covered. "Your partners in San Francisco are already distancing themselves. It's over." Thorne's face twisted with rage. "Nothing's over!" He wheeled his horse, spurring it towards Sarah with murderous intent. The animal's hooves thundered across the yard as Sarah stood her ground, the locket cool against her skin. Time seemed to slow. Sarah was aware of Jackson shouting, of guns, firing, of the horse's hot breath approaching. Then her hand found the derringer hidden in her skirts, a gift from Miss Rebecca, who believed in being prepared. The small gun barked once, and Thorne toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The fight drained from Thorne's men at the sight of their leader fallen. Sheriff Matthews moved in with his deputies, disarming and binding them with swift efficiency. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a yard scattered with dropped weapons and surrendered men. Jackson reached Sarah as her legs finally began to tremble. His arm around her waist was both support and embrace, propriety forgotten in the aftermath of violence. The silver locket rose and fell with her rapid breathing. Its pattern of roses and thorns now seemed a perfect metaphor for their lives. "I never thought," she whispered, "when you used to court me with poetry and fine manners, that one day we'd face down killers together." His laugh held wonder and relief in equal measure. "And I never imagined that the woman who thought me too refined for ranch life would help save it with such courage." His free hand touched the locket gently. "Though perhaps we both should have known, the strongest metal is that which has been tempered by fire." Around them the ranch hummed with activity as the sheriff's men took charge of prisoners, and ranch hands tended to minor wounds. But on the porch, in the growing morning light, Sarah and Jackson remained still, the silver locket marking this moment when past and present, gentility and strength, love lost and love found, finally merged into something new and unbreakable. The territorial court documents lay spread across the ranch house dining table, their official seals and formal language a sharp contrast to the violent events they described. Sarah watched as Jackson and the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Blackwood, reviewed the testimony that would bring Thorne and his conspirators to justice. "The murder charge is ironclad," Margaret said, tapping a particularly thick document. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and Thorne's own confession during the confrontation. But it's these financial records that will bring down the entire corrupt network. She shuffled through papers filled with dates, amounts, and names that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "Thomas's death won't have been for nothing," Sarah said softly, touching one of the affidavits that bore her signature. Her testimony filled 3 pages, every detail of that terrible morning preserved in precise legal language that somehow made it both more real and more distant. Jackson placed his hand over hers, where it rested on the documents. "The territorial governor himself is calling for a full investigation. Thorne's allies are scrambling to save themselves, turning evidence against each other." The ranch house had become the unofficial headquarters for the prosecution's efforts. Every day brought new faces, legal clerks, federal marshals, newspaper reporters from as far as San Francisco. The story had captured the territory's imagination, a wealthy rancher and a farmer's widow joining forces to expose corruption and murder. "The Railroad Commission is particularly interested in these land transfers," Margaret noted, sorting through another stack of documents. "Seems Thorne wasn't just selling route information, He was manipulating the proposed lines to increase the value of properties he'd stolen. Sarah recognized some of the deeds, farms and ranches whose owners had been threatened or driven away. Can the land be returned to its rightful owners? Already in process, Jackson confirmed. I've been contacting the families, offering to help them resettle if they wish to return. His refined accent carried the satisfaction of a man seeing justice done through legitimate means rather than frontier violence. The community's support had been overwhelming. Every day brought wagon loads of food from neighboring ranches, ensuring the steady stream of legal workers and witnesses were well fed. Ranch wives took turns helping Miss Rebecca manage the increased household burden, while their husbands volunteered to cover the regular ranch work so Jackson's hands could assist with security and escort duties. Found another set of telegraph records, Billy announced, hurrying in with fresh papers. The young ranch hand had proved invaluable, his quick mind and knowledge of local geography helping piece together the movement of Thorne's men over the past years. Margaret immediately began organizing the new evidence into her carefully structured case files. Perfect. This connects the territorial secretary directly to the land scheme. His resignation should be on the governor's desk by morning. Sarah studied the growing pile of documents, each one a step toward justice. Among them lay a formal letter that had arrived that morning, an offer from the Railroad Commission to purchase a right-of-way through her land at 10 times what Thorne had demanded. The route would run alongside the creek, just as Thomas had predicted, but now it would be secured legally, with fair compensation and proper documentation. "What will you do?" Jackson asked quietly when he noticed her looking at the offer. "About the farm." She touched the silver locket that hadn't left her neck since the confrontation. "I've been thinking. The railroad will bring new settlers, families looking to start fresh. The farm, it could become something more than just a memorial to Thomas. It could help others build the kind of life we dreamed of." Jackson's eyes held understanding. "A place for new beginnings?" "Yes." Sarah picked up another document, the draft of a foundation charter. "With the railroad money, we could establish a fund. Help honest families get their start. Teach them what Thomas and I learned about farming this land." She paused, then added softly, "With your help, if you're willing." The moment was interrupted by Margaret clearing her throat. "Speaking of documentation," she said with a slight smile, "if you two are planning to combine your properties and efforts, there are some legal forms we should discuss." Sarah felt warmth rise in her cheeks, but Jackson's hand found hers among the papers. "I believe," he said with quiet certainty, "those particular documents can wait until after we've secured justice for Thomas and the others. Some things deserve their own moment." Around them, the work of justice continued, papers being sorted, testimony recorded, evidence catalogued. But in that brief exchange lay the promise of a future where love and law, refinement and frontier strength could build something far greater than either of them had imagined in their younger days. The new ranch sign waited in the carpenter's workshop, its freshly carved letters still covered to protect them from dust. Sarah ran her fingers over the cloth, feeling the raised edges of what she knew lay beneath. Reed and Mitchell Ranch, a simple ampersand joining their names just as life had joined their paths in unexpected ways. Miguel suggested bronze letters, Jackson said from the doorway, his quiet arrival making her smile. He'd grown more contemplative since the trial's end, as if the lifting of one burden had allowed others, more personal, to surface. "But I thought you'd prefer something carved from the land itself." "Oak," Sarah confirmed, recognizing the solid weight of the wood. "Like the trees that mark the boundary between your ranch and my farm." She paused, correcting herself. "Our properties now?" Jackson moved closer, his presence warming the cool morning air. "I've been thinking about what you said, about making the farm a place for new beginnings. The first families could arrive by spring, if we start the preparations now." The cloth slipped beneath Sarah's fingers, revealing a corner of the sign. The lettering was beautiful, refined yet sturdy, much like the man who had commissioned it. Thomas would have loved that idea. He always said the territory needed more farmers who understood the land, not just what they could take from it. "We could teach them what you both learned," Jackson suggested. "Combine your farming knowledge with the ranch's resources. Give them a real chance at success." His hand joined hers on the sign's surface. "Build something that honors the past, while looking to the future." The workshop's door creaked open, admitting Miss Rebecca with a pot of coffee, a knowing smile. "Thought you two might need this. The hands are asking about when to hang the new sign." Sarah exchanged a glance with Jackson, seeing her own mixture of readiness and hesitation reflected in his eyes. So much had changed since the day he'd found her in the desert. Justice had been served, corruption exposed. Their separate worlds merged into something stronger than either had been alone. "There's no rush," Jackson said, gently understanding her need to move forward at her own pace. "The ranch won't change just because we change its name." But Sarah found herself ready to take this step. "No," she said, pulling the cloth away completely. "We should do it today. The past few months have taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means building something new from what remains." The sign's full text emerged into the morning light. Beneath their joined names, smaller letters read, "Where Hope Takes Root." The phrase had come to Sarah one evening as she watched Jackson teaching a group of children about crop rotation in the ranch's kitchen garden, his natural grace making complex ideas accessible to young minds. "I had Miguel add something too," Jackson said, turning the sign slightly. There, along the edge in careful Spanish script, were the words, "Segundo chances," second chances. Miss Rebecca nodded approvingly. "About time this place had a name that tells its true story." She began pouring coffee into 3 cups. "The hands have been taking bets on when you two would make it official. The ranch name or Jackson let the question hang, his refined manners warring with barely concealed hope. Sarah touched the silver locket at her throat, then reached for his hand. "Both, I think. Some changes don't need to wait for perfect moments. They just need the courage to acknowledge what's already true." The workshop filled with morning light as the sun cleared the eastern hills. Outside, they could hear the ranch coming to life, horses being fed, children heading to the schoolhouse, wagon wheels on the yard's packed earth. The sounds of community, of life continuing and growing stronger. "I'll tell the hands to gather after breakfast," Miss Rebecca said, hiding her smile behind her coffee cup. "Hanging a new ranch sign deserves a proper ceremony." But Sarah and Jackson hardly heard her leave, too caught up in the moment of quiet understanding between them. The sign beneath their joined hands represented more than just a name change. It was a declaration that love could bloom again after loss, that refinement and strength could coexist, that second chances were possible if you were brave enough to grasp them. "Together, then?" Jackson asked softly, his question encompassing far more than just the sign's installation. Sarah's answer came without hesitation, her heart finally at peace with both past and future. "Together." The wedding band shimmered in the autumn sunlight, its gold surface etched with a pattern of wheat stalks and roses, a design Jackson had commissioned from a San Francisco jeweler to represent their united worlds. Sarah watched as he slipped it onto her finger, his hands steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. The ceremony took place in the ranch's courtyard, transformed by the community's efforts into a celebration of both love and survival. Garlands of wild roses and wheat hung from every post, their meaning lost on none of the gathered witnesses. Miss Rebecca had outdone herself coordinating the preparations, ensuring every detail honored both the refined and rustic aspects of their lives. "The ring," Reverend Harrison proclaimed to the assembled crowd, "is a circle without beginning or end. Like the love that brings Sarah and Jackson together, it represents not just their future, but the past that shaped them and the community that supports them." Sarah's gaze swept over the gathered faces, ranch hands and their families, neighboring farmers. Even Margaret Blackwood had returned from the territorial capital for the occasion. In the front row, Young Billy beamed with pride in his new suit, while Miguel and his wife dabbed at tears unashamedly. The morning had begun with a private moment at Thomas's grave, where Sarah had placed a bouquet of wheat stalks tied with ribbon. "You taught me that love grows where it's planted," she'd whispered to the quiet dawn. "Thank you for helping me become strong enough to love again." Now, as Jackson's ring joined the delicate gold band he'd given her during their private engagement, Sarah felt the rightness of this moment. They'd chosen to be married in the same courtyard where they'd faced down Thorn and his men, transforming a place of confrontation into one of celebration. "In the presence of God and these witnesses," Reverend Harrison continued, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jackson's kiss was gentle yet sure, carrying the promise of all they'd built together. The crowd's cheers echoed across the ranch, startling a flock of doves into flight from the barn roof, an unplanned but perfect touch that made even the most hardened cowboys smile. The celebration that followed blended their worlds seamlessly. Tables groaned with Miss Rebecca's finest dishes alongside traditional ranch barbecue. A string quartet Jackson had brought from San Francisco alternated with local fiddle players. Children played between the legs of dancing adults, their laughter a reminder of the future they were all building together. "Look," Jackson murmured during a quiet moment, nodding toward the gathered crowd. Sarah followed his gaze to see three, a family sitting together, the first applicants for their farming initiative, already forming bonds of friendship as they shared plates of wedding feast. "They'll be ready to start in the spring," Sarah said, touching her wedding band. "The Railway Commission approved the final routes yesterday. The compensation funds are secured. And the foundation charter?" Jackson's arm tightened around her. "Waste. Signed this morning. The Reed Mitchell Agricultural Foundation is officially registered with the territorial government." She smiled up at him. "Though I think Miss Rebecca's already calling it the Hope Takes Root Foundation in her. Letters to potential families." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by Miguel calling for attention. The ranch hands had prepared a surprise, a new sign for the foundation's office, carved from the same oak as the ranch sign, bearing the words "Hope Takes Root" in both English and Spanish. "Because some things," Miguel said with a grin, "are too important for just one language." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the celebration showed no signs of slowing. Sarah and Jackson moved among their guests, their joined hands displaying matching bands that caught the light with each movement. Every detail of the wedding reflected their journey, from the roses and wheat decorations to the mix of refined and rustic celebrations, from the guest list that ignored social boundaries to the plans for future growth that dominated many conversations. "Happy?" Jackson asked softly as they paused for a moment alone, the wedding band cool against her skin. Where he held her hand, Sarah thought of all the paths that had led them here, grief and healing, violence and justice, loss and love found again. "More than happy," she replied. "Complete." Around them, their community celebrated not just a wedding, but the triumph of hope over fear, of justice over corruption, of love that had grown strong enough to bridge two worlds. The wedding bands on their fingers caught the last rays of sunset, promising not just a union of two people, but the continuation of a legacy that would help others find their own paths to happiness in this ever-changing territory. The family. A portrait hung in the ranch house's main hall, capturing a moment 1 year after the wedding. The photographer had insisted on setting up outdoors, positioning the group so that both the new ranch sign and the foundation's office were visible. In the background, Sarah often paused to study it, marveling at how much could change in a single year. Jackson stood tall and dignified in his best suit, yet his posture showed the easy confidence of a working rancher rather than the stiff formality he'd once maintained. Sarah sat beside him, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other holding a ledger from the foundation. Around them gathered their extended family, not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. Miss Rebecca stood proudly at Sarah's shoulder, while Miguel and his family clustered to Jackson's right. Young Billy, now the Foundation's most enthusiastic apprentice teacher, grinned from the back row. The three pioneering families who'd started. The farming program sat on simple wooden benches, their children arranged carefully in front. The portrait captured more than just people. It told the story of their success. Behind the group, wagons loaded with lumber for new homesteads waited to be distributed. The railway line, now completed, curved gently along the creek bed, its presence promising connection rather than division. The Foundation's office door stood open, revealing the oak sign that had become a beacon of hope for families seeking a fresh start. Sarah's silver locket gleamed at her throat, while her wedding band caught the sun alongside Jackson's matching ring. These small details, preserved in sepia tones, spoke of promises kept and dreams realized. The photographer had even managed to capture the way Jackson's hand rested protectively near Sarah's shoulder, a gesture as natural as breathing after a year of marriage. The future they'd envisioned was taking shape. The Foundation had already helped 5 families establish successful farms, with more applications arriving weekly. The ranch prospered, its combination of traditional ways and modern methods becoming a model for others in the territory. Their story had become legend, the refined rancher and the farmer's widow who had turned tragedy into triumph, creating a legacy of hope from the ashes of loss. But perhaps the portrait's greatest testament lay in what couldn't be seen: the strength of a community united by purpose, the healing of old wounds, the promise of new life growing beneath Sarah's heart. In the faces captured by the camera's eye, one could read the truth that had brought them all together. That love, like hope, takes root in the most unexpected places, growing stronger when nurtured by understanding hearts and willing hands. And if anyone noticed how the photographer had positioned Thomas's original homestead in the distant background, visible through the morning mist, they understood it for what it was. Not a shadow on their happiness, but a reminder that the past could stand in peaceful witness to the future, its lessons learned, its sacrifice honored, its hope forever blooming in the fertile soil of new beginnings.